We are lucky to be joined by Blaine Schmaltz from Blaine's Best Seeds and Carolyn Lane from Nature's Organic Grist. This is going to be completely informal. We'd like to have everyone throw out questions whenever they come along. We've got about an hour or so with these folks. And I'm going to lead off with a question that I have had, and it came back to me when I talked to some processors. Why do we call it Emmer, and are we going to keep calling it Emmer?
I personally don't know what the correct verbiage to use is, because every time I go to a store and look for it, I find the word farrow. But they also have recently put it in parentheses, Emmer, behind it so that the consumer can relate. I don't know where that actually will go, but I know farrow has sort of been the lead. If someone needs to discover it or find it, they usually use the word farrow. So.
And I think that's probably because most consumers and the manufacturers here have been importing it from Italy, where the word there is farrow. And so, you know, as long as that's kind of been the historical usage of it, what we're trying to do now is to educate people to use the word Emmer. So we'll usually label it Emmer and farrow in parentheses instead of the other way around. I've heard that in Italy, the use of farrow is often a blend of varieties. I think sometimes can even be a blend of grains. Some of the products that you see in the stores are really uniform in color. I looked at one the other day, I think it was at Lund's, that looked like, I was calling it calico farrow because it had so many shapes and colors and sizes of the kernels. So I thought, well, that would certainly support the idea of farrow being a blend. At this point, I think all the Emmer that we would be marketing as U.S. grown would be one variety and be, you know, very uniform. So anyway, I think a lot of it's just education that Emmer is. Well, I think in restaurants too, they're still usually calling it farrow. We're seeing it trend more in some of the fancier restaurants, especially East Coast. And I think every time I've seen it in menus or on their website, it's farrow.
I think that we should call it Emmer because farrow is, just as you said, even different eco-regions within Italy, farrow can be different from one to the other because it's blends. And so they're blending it, so that means there's no consistency. If we want to market this crop, I think we should call it Emmer. If you go back to the old, historically, ever since our forefathers came to this country, the German Russians and those people that brought Emmer with them in their socks, you know, that we've been calling it the wrong thing forever. And if you read back into the old 1901 USDA publication, they started off and they say, you know, they list all the words for Emmer, or for einkorn and spelt in all the languages. And you know what, when it comes down to when they say Emmer, there is no other word for it. It's a German word, and that's called the same thing no matter where we go. And so we were incorrectly calling it spelts forever. Rick knows that. I mean, you know, so if anybody says spelts with a Z, they're basically some people that have been continuing growing this crop yet, and that's why you find this up in our area. In other words, you know, south central North Dakota, north central South Dakota, the area where most of the seed come from, they called it spelts. So bottom line is, if we're going to market the crop, I think we should call it Emmer, because when you say farrow, there's no consistency.
I think in biblical times too, the original wheats that were grown at that time was an Emmer. So, right, and if it's U.S. grown, it is Emmer, not the traditional definition of farrow. So, yeah, it's good to dig into that question a little more deeply.
I agree with both of those comments because it is confusing. I've taken quite the liberty to check almost every place I can to find it. And the biggest problem is the variability for the regions it came out of when you see the word farrow. And it will confuse everybody because some of the kernels are more plump. And in some cases, there may be some admixtures because farrow is used pretty generally. You know, I might make a comment. I didn't know we were going to quite do the format this way, but you know, is there anyone in here that's really not familiar with ancient grains or the heritage grains as we call it? You know, so the evolution, you know, we went to local foods and then we went to slow foods and now it's nutrient dense foods. That's really where we're at in time. And interesting enough, to rediscover these ancient grains and work with them, you know, really what it is a bridge from the past era of time. And this, so obviously, I guess the point I want to make is that I don't believe that this is a fad or just a current buzzword to be used. So this production information that we're giving today is of the utmost importance because we must respect the lineage and the future bridge of these nutrient-dense grains that we have actually available to us. And so the hurdles, we have many, you know, hurdles that we're going to go through and have gone through and trying to get this to the marketplace. But we must recognize its economic value to the growing food system and what it means to consumers. We must also address the processing requirements, which we're touching on, because they're not usual competitive costs in other same use grains, and that's a big stumbling block. We must address regional grower pools for sustainable transportation to the processor or distribution point. All of the above in past history were not concerns of the past because you remember the evolution of these grains. In biblical times, they were scattered along well-traveled paths in arid climates with little care. The grains were then harvested and used and transported just as were needed en route for food or feed. So basically all of this has provided us what we have access today, these grains that prove the test of time. So in a different time, or in current times, we must address survival in a different way, but mimic its ancestral survival. So my concerns are seed availability. Steve touched on that. One thing we didn't really touch on is regional adaptability and also the production requirements. Some of the knowledge that I got from other producers in different regions is these heritage grains don't necessarily respond to the same production methods we use to get peak yields off of our cereal grains as we know it today. So someone that wants to put maximum yield to this kind of a grain, it might fall flat in their face and get no more production than they would if they wouldn't have done it. And so from my experience, it's been proved many times, if you take it to an irrigated climate, and if it's in a conventional method to where they throw fertilizer at it, they can actually receive less yield because the stand won't hold the grain. And so I guess these heritage grains are really truly sustainable grains that were developed in arid regions with very little care. That's not saying that once we start to test the nutrient-dense capabilities of these foods, that we don't need to have very well-balanced soils. We do, that's part of it. But we finally can possibly have a grain that can transfer these minerals and nutrients from the soil and actually take it to the kernel itself so that the food is nutrient dense, and that's really the goal. So another comment is milling. We're touching upon that. Everybody's afraid to discuss that because it's really big stumbling block. These products are bulky. Transportation is an issue because you're shipping really basically only the half of the usable product when it goes down the road. Milling sometimes takes 2 or 3 additional times, and that's expensive for someone, and it usually ends up being everybody's expense. And so that's why I want us to think really close today about to do things regionally. You know and have heard many times that the food that you eat every time you touch your fork travels somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 miles to get so you use it. It may have been grown in your back door, but it's going to go somewhere else to get processed, somewhere else to a marketing point, somewhere else freighted out. So we have to truly address the sustainability. The word's used real loosely, as we all know, but we're going to have to be real cautious about how we go forward with it.
Be better at this, but yes, Kamut has the same number of chromosomes as Emmer does, just like Derm does. how it happened to make it a little bit different, so in other words, chronologically and over time, it shows it probably about the same time, it just happens to be a free thrashing form. Kamut is
Looks like
considered,
Durham.
yes, it's very similar to Durham, but it's different too, it's a different subspecies, correct, Frank? And so, but they have the same number of chromosomes, again, so Emmer does too. So they basically, how they all happened about over time, there's a lot of different ways, but it's just different crosses and stuff that happened, And again, the Kamut is just a free thrashing form.
My original seed I've received from the research center that Gil Stalneck worked with.
Right.
We've kept some of that seed lot all the time. As I know it now, I believe it was in Moccasin, Montana, they were doing the reproduction. And I think this last year was the last reproduction cycle that they had room for, but they may do. Doug, would you be familiar with if they are or not? I made a call out there, and the few seed lots that they had left this year, they didn't have anymore. So anyway, and to answer your question, I am planting my own seed every year, really not doing anything other than taking my cleanest lot that I can use in the hull. And usually if you go over a gravity separator, you can get the most dense seed. So I have milling equipment. So it's easy for me to clean up my own seed lots, especially on a small scale. I don't know, did I answer your question?
So let me ask, do you dehull your own?
No, I have had dehullers in the past and found it to be a very tedious job to do on a large scale. And so I sold my dehuller to another artisan fella that is doing it on a small scale on his own farm.
Okay, so you treat your field of Emmer, there's your food field and then there's your seed field, in other words. So you keep your seed field clean down.
Absolutely.
Ship your food field
Yeah.
away.
In my case, I'm actually doing protocol through our state seed department to keep the lot pure and regenerated for all of you to use.
And it's all certified or registered.
That's correct, yeah. So it all originated from breeder seed, foundation seed, and I still keep some of those lots on hand in case we have mishaps like 40 inches of rain or something like that. Oh, there's actually many machines that have evolved through time. Some of them are like discs, be like stones that run at bevel directions towards them. Some are impact hullers, which just speed around a drum. What are some of them? A lot of them centrifugal, sort of a centrifugal fuge running against sort of like de-bearding equipment, if I may use that word. Doug, can you help on some way? Or?
Get most of them.
Yeah, I think probably in theory there's probably 3 principles for dehulling.
Pass that around.
There's a lot of things to take note from in the industry. The oat people have had to do it. The barley people have had to do things. The rice people have, the millet people. There's a lot of dehulling in a lot of different crops. They're just all different. Sort of what's unique to our crop is to remove this light hull and not damage the brand. So, but in the same token, you'll see our product on the shelf pearled, so we run it right back through and abuse it again. And so, it's like, how are we going to address this? I mean, actually, Carolyn, I'm going to let you address the pearled market versus the unpearled.
Well, it seems that what you see on the store shelves is usually pearled, or that outer layer is scoured off. And my understanding is mainly to extend the shelf life, and because of the volatile oils in the outer layer. But then again, you're throwing away some of your nutrition too. So we find that actually we sell for bulk ingredient manufacturers, we sell a lot more of the hulled, which I'm glad to see. Pearling is a pain in the rear. Plus, again, you're grinding away your nutrients, so you just have a lot lower extraction rate. And so I think some of that is educating our customers. They've asked, so what's the difference between the two? And you send them a sample of the two, and hulled is a little bit cheaper because it doesn't take that extra layer of processing. And so most of them we've been able to convince just to go ahead and take the hulled. And Rick's question is if anybody has removed the hull by steaming it. I haven't heard of that. I know it can be parboiled, but that's different yet. And I think that'd be after it's already hulled. Boy, anybody else have any feedback on that?
I just read something about, I think it was oats or something that the article mentioned something about steaming that before you try to dehull it with some type of machine. I didn't really take notes on it, but I just a couple of days read across something like that, yeah.
So that'd take a whole different kind of a setup of equipment, the processor too, besides just having your cleaning and your hulling equipment.
I think it was just of utilizing a certain machine to be able to dehull the oats. That was one way, I think it was oats, that was one way to be able to use that machine to accomplish that, where otherwise it wouldn't work.
Guys, here's your next research project.
The outcome, and you can't figure that part out. But the heat thing, so then there's a little bit of research being done. Well, when we harvest it, should we freeze it first and then dehull it and see if it hulls better? And I think they're gonna come up with a good conclusion on that. So maybe not dehulling right away at harvest, but letting it go through that, we call it the dormant season. Other people call it the refrigerator season.
And maybe the humidity factor is really low.
Right,
too,
correct.
that it's
Yeah, because
not-
the bran will be attached, the grounds will be attached, so.
Last question?
Question for Caroline. You had mentioned the Emmer going rancid easier once it's dehulled. How is Emmer different than modern wheat, free threshing wheat in storage, in that it is more susceptible to going bad?
I'm not a food scientist, but I'm assuming it's the types of oils that are in that outer layer. I don't know if anybody else can add into this too, but we haven't had that problem with wheat. But with Emmer, we learned the hard way that it does have to be refrigerated. And does anybody else have any experience with that? What would cause that? We were told by the miller that it was the oils.
It's a different seed composition. It's more oil than wheat kernel. That's why it gets oxidized and then get that rancid flavor.
So like the hull-less oats had that problem. There was a lot of oil content. It was very unstorable. Flax degradates.
Barley, even the one that has to be refrigerated. Yeah. I'm wondering too, just how moisture coming out of the field and in storage affects the hulling. I think we've usually been bringing it in somewhere between 13 and 14% moisture. Probably maybe 12 would be more ideal, but maybe that's something you could comment, or even Doug Stengel, what you've observed as far as extraction rates depending on moisture. Anybody's got comments? I just know we had a couple loads where I think that maybe it was like 13. Or maybe there was one load that was lower. I think there was more breakage, but I don't know where the cutoff point is. But I guess that's something we should be paying attention to too. If you bring in something that's 9 or 10% moisture, are you going to have a lot more loss when you try to dehull it like a desert grown stuff?
Sort of in line with that thought is that sometimes the Emmer has a really nice sized berry to it. Depends on the year it's grown in. And then the next year is sort of an elongated rye-like looking thin kernel, really tough to mill, right? Yeah, so it really, really depends on that harvest time. And maybe as they go forward in variety selections and that type of thing, maybe we'll come to some different conclusions and what the extraction rate is.
I would think another thing that to be working on for even farm cleaning systems, or some kind of a length grader, because if the Emmer is coming in at all different size kernels, it's not really uniform, and then it's tough to get a even grind on it when you're dehulling it or purling it or whatever. So that's something I think we would need to consider for future systems.
We spent a lot of time talking about Emmer, and I don't know a lot about einkorn, and I don't, do you? So we're probably the wrong people on the panel to talk about einkorn, but I'm sure Steve or Frank could enlighten us a little bit about you don't quite have these problems we've been discussing with einkorn, do you?
Dehulling?
Yeah.
My preliminary stuff that I started running through, I think it's going to be harder to dehull.
Oh, it's twice the yield.
No. That should be great. Well, everyone, let's thank Blaine and Carolyn so much for